Hi everyone, my name is Syropolous, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Boston College. And although I'm saddened to not be able to join you, I'm excited about getting the opportunity to talk to you about some of the work that I've done together with my collaborators at Boston College and UMass Amherst. This work focuses on responsibility to future generations as a potential moral reframing mechanism to help address climate change. And by addressing climate change, I'm referring to the fact that it could potentially help motivate individuals to engage in climate action. So, as I feel we all know, climate change is one of the most pressing social issues that we are facing as a collective, and it's only likely to grow worse for future generations of people if left unaddressed. And I think this part, the fact that climate change, if left unaddressed, will only grow worse for future people, could be a potentially leveraging point to help motivate individuals to act environmentally. So, before I dig in as to why I believe that, I want to first highlight two phenomena. The first is social discounting, which suggests that individuals are more likely to care about outcomes that influence close others relatively to socially distant others. And also, they're more likely to care about outcomes that occur now in the present rather than outcomes that will occur in the future. And this is temporal discounting. And jointly, these two phenomena construe what I would refer to as intergenerational discounting, which is, I think, very prevalent in climate change as, again, if we don't address the issue as soon as possible, it will only grow more worse for future generations of people. By intergenerational, I also want to highlight that this is a two-part word and it has many meanings, but here specifically I'm focusing on the fact that we as people have a sort of a responsibility to help future people since they don't have a voice. That's what intergenerational here means. So, I'm going to lay out three arguments, which I will hopefully convince you by presenting some relevant data about how responsibility to future generations could be a potentially useful mechanism in this context. The first is that beliefs about responsibility to future people are widespread. The second is that they're depoliticized, and I operationalize this sort of depoliticization of these beliefs by showing evidence that they are either weakly or not significantly correlated with political conservatism, or that they are endorsed at least to the same degree or slightly higher in some contexts by political conservatives. And third, I'm also going to show you some results, both correlational and experimental, about how these beliefs predict pro-environmental intentions, policy support, as well as behavior in a donation task. So, starting with evidence about how widespread these beliefs are, here we have data from 2 rounds of the Eurobarometer collected in 2010 and 2011 across 34 countries, each with a nationally representative sample, totaling roughly 100,000 participants. And what we can see is that in each of the 34 countries, except one, agreement with the statement, seen as the total of responses that were tend to agree or totally agree, exceeded 50% of the population. And in all countries by 2, this also exceeded 70% of the population. So it seems that universally, at least in the European context, people tend to agree that we need to reform now to benefit future generations, even if it comes at their personal sacrifice. And in fact, when we compare this sort of endorsement of responsibility to future people relative to other types of responsibility, such as personal responsibility or ascribed responsibility to help to reduce one's own contribution to climate change, we see that responsibility to future generation is significantly endorsed more. And why did I choose a particular type of responsibility as a comparison? Well, because there's a lot of work that suggests how personally responsible we feel to reduce climate change predicts for environmental behavior. So Here's the model of values, beliefs, and norms theory, where we can see that descriptions of responsibility received from environmental behavior. Here's the norm activation theory model, where again, ascription of responsibility or denial of responsibility predicts norms, which then predicts behavior. And here is the theory of planned behavior model, where we have subjective norms, of which personal responsibility is a component, predicting intentions, which predicts behavior. And in fact, this comparison actually suggests that for Democrats, there seems to not be a difference. But when we look at independents and Republicans, people who are, based on existing evidence, more skeptical about climate change and science, as well as less likely to engage in climate action, this type of responsibility is significantly endorsed more than one's personal responsibility to reduce climate change. And this, we have replicated this in several examples as well, that I'm not presenting here for brevity. And when we look at the actual correlations between different sort of measures of perceived responsibility to future generations and political ideology across different types of samples. So we have one sample with 3,000 participants that's nationally representative of the US population from the Public Research on Religion Institute in the United States. 2 ethnic samples, 1 prolific sample, and the combined Eurobarometer sample I showed you earlier, where we can see that the correlation ranges from sort of weak to non-significant. This is a negative correlation because lower scores indicated more conservatism here. So they do seem to be relatively depoliticized. But what about their effectiveness? Well, here's a short report that I published together with Professor Markowitz 2 years ago, focusing on how responsibility towards future generations predicts different environmental outcomes from the Public Religion Research Institute I highlighted earlier. And as you can see, even when we control for a host of covariates that have been deemed important for predicting environmental actions, beliefs, and behaviors, you can see it here on the screen, we predicted greater support for climate policies, more positive feelings towards nature, greater acceptance of climate change and global warming as an actual crisis, as well as greater trust in science within the context of climate change. But what about experimental evidence? Well, seeking to provide such evidence, we conducted a large-scale experiment on prolific. This was pre-registered, and we were well-powered to the degree that we were able to test for differences between each of the respective conditions I will show you in the next slide relative to a control. And importantly, there have been some evidence for ways to potentially increase responsibility to future generations in existing work, and we sought to replicate these 3 manipulations that past research has examined, as well as we also wanted to determine whether 2 new manipulations could prove effective. So the final sample sizes range from 480 to 520 participants per condition, which sort of allowed us to detect effect sizes as small as a co-XD of 0.16 to 0.17. So, what were these conditions? Well, the first one was the manipulation that Zaval and colleagues, 2015 in Psych Science, used, which had participants reflect on their legacy and the values and traits they wanted to pass on to future people, and they did so by writing a short paragraph. The second one was taken from Shroom 2021 in Climatic Change, which focused on a manipulation that asked participants to write a letter to their child in the future in the year 2050, telling them what they can do today to help leave a safer, greener, and more flourishing world. The only difference here is that rather than focusing on the participant's own child in the future, we had this be a child in the future. We also used a direct manipulation of Watkins and Goodwin 2020, a personality and social psychology bulletin, where the researchers had participants reflect on sacrifices made by previous generations. And the two new conditions we created, one, we wanted to sort of have tasks that didn't involve writing, but rather something that participants could do in a more natural setting. So we had them watch a video about the Grand Canyon and and how it's necessary to sort of help protect it and preserve it for future generations. And finally, we had participants read an excerpt from the recently published book, But Beyond the Future, by William McCaskill, a sort of popular science book arguing about long-termism, which is sort of this extension of effective activism that seeks to instill the value that we need to act now to protect all future generations of people. And then we had our different outcomes, which were from our mental intentions, policy support, as well as the donation task that I mentioned earlier. And the two aforementioned types of responsibility as mediators. And so what did we find? Well, we found that all conditions increased responsibility to future generations relative to the control. And again, all conditions increased responsibility, personal responsibility to reduce climate change relative to the control, except for the sacrifice condition, which you can see in the red color. When it comes to intentions, again, all conditions increased how likely people reported that they would be to engage in different environmental actions in the next 3 months. Importantly, the effect for the climate, for the latter condition, far outperformed every other condition. As you can see here, it was a Cohen's d of roughly 0.5, while everything else was around 0.2. When it comes to policy support, however, only the long-termism and the latter conditions successfully increased how much people self-reported being supportive of different policies that sought to address climate change. And finally, when it comes to the donation task, although there was a trend for the legacy layer, which would have replicated Zaval and colleagues, we only found that the latter condition actually increased how much people were willing to donate to a charity relative to the control, successfully replicated through 2021. So, just to go back to the original argument, well, I wanted to argue that the responsibility of future generations would be potentially a moralist framing mechanism to help reduce climate change. And I would argue this in 3 ways. First, by showing evidence that these beliefs are widespread, which I'm hopeful that the nationally representative data I presented with support this claim. Second, that these beliefs are depoliticized, evident by the fact that they're not significantly or weakly correlated with political ideology, which I also hope you are somewhat convinced of. And finally, that they are effective, which would be evident in the aforementioned correlational and experimental evidence that I have shown you, which, again, I'm hopeful you will be somewhat convinced of. Yay! So, with that, I would like to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you, even though I wasn't able to make it in person. And I would also like to thank all of my collaborators for their feedback and their support throughout this work, the different funders that helped make this work possible, and my cat Mochi for her emotional support. Thank you very much.